Well, I think you can really trace it back to at least the 1960s, if not earlier. What we started to see going on in American politics in the 1960s and continuing into the 70s and 80s was really the disintegration of the old New Deal coalition and alignment that had been kind of put together by Franklin Roosevelt, and that sustained the Democratic Party as the dominant party in American politics for many years. That coalition consisted of a number of groups, such as white Southerners, Northern white ethnic voters, and white working class voters, that inherently had little in common with each other, particularly when you add in the growing representation of African American voters after the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act. So this coalition was sort of inherently unstable, and what we began to see in the 1960s, especially after the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the growth of the African American electorate, was that the more conservative elements in that coalition, particularly white Southerners, but also conservative white ethnic voters, began to move toward the Republicans. We had an ideological realignment that began. It didn't happen overnight. It was not something that occurred in a single election or a couple of elections. It was something that took place over several decades, actually. But we gradually began to see these more conservative voters moving away from the Democrats and into the Republican camp. And on the other hand, in response to that, more moderate to liberal voters who had been aligned with the Republicans, especially in parts of the country where you had moderate to liberal Republicans like the Northeast, they began to move away from the Republicans and toward the Democrats as the Republican Party became increasingly conservative. So you can see this beginning with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy in 1972 and continuing with Ronald Reagan's presidential campaigns, and then certainly in the 1990s with the takeover of the Republican Party in Congress by a more conservative group of leaders led by Newt Gingrich. So essentially what was happening here was that at the elite level, we were seeing an increasing ideological polarization, and that change began to affect the loyalties of the voters, and increasingly over time. And by the time we got to the 1990s, it had reached the point where the old Democratic coalition and the Democratic dominance of at least Congress was no longer existed. And it's really continued even up to the present time. Now, something else that's been happening over this entire time period, and especially the last couple of decades, it's also playing into this, has been the demographic changes taking place in the electorate and the growing diversity of the American electorate, where non-white voters are becoming a larger and larger share of the electorate, and particularly of the Democratic coalition. So that by 2008, when you look at the contributions of different racial and ethnic groups to the party coalitions, you see that non-whites made up over 40% of Democratic voters, whereas non-whites were only about 7 or 8% of Republican voters. So there's this growing divergence between the parties, both in terms of their racial and ethnic groups that support the parties, and also in terms of ideology and issues. It's the more engaged segment of the public that really becomes increasingly polarized, because they're the ones who are really following these debates, who are really attentive to what is going on in the Congress, to the positions of the parties, and so they tend to react much more quickly than people who are just not paying attention. But what happens over time is that even though this process of realignment really was, I think, initiated by political elites for strategic reasons, so you had Republican politicians in particular who I think saw opportunities to win over some of these voting groups that had been traditionally supporting the Democrats. But once the public, or at least the attentive segment of the public, becomes polarized, that in turn sort of starts to constrain the positions of political elites themselves. And now they have to reflect the views of the voters who make up their own base. And so what we're seeing today is that it's gotten to the point where the party leaders and candidates for office are really kind of constrained to a large degree by the polarization that exists among the attentive public. So if you look, for example, at primary voters, you find that Republican primary voters are really quite conservative by and large. Democratic primary voters tend to be fairly liberal, and therefore candidates who want to be successful in politics have to appeal to these primary voters. In addition, there are more and more congressional districts and even states where one party is dominant, and therefore the key to success in those types of districts and those types of states is, again, just to appeal to the party base. And there's less need to worry about appealing to voters from the other party. So political campaigns have become more about mobilizing the base than about appealing to the swing voters in the middle.